I recently recorded some of my notes on Robinson Jeffers' 1924 poem Tamar, but I didn't manage to conclude my thoughts in the allotted time. As I suggested in that review, let us take a look at Jeffers' magnificent 1926 poem, Apology for Bad Dreams. The poem first presents an expansive scene of beauty, and then deep within the heart of the beauty, a horrible scene of two people beating a horse, and then, zooming out, back to the great beauty. At a much greater distance, we see Venus herself, celestial goddess of beauty. The poet seems to have discovered the grotesque folded deep within the beautiful. He then cites Isaiah 45:7. I create good, and I create evil. I am the Lord. Now, Bible apologists may or may not maintain that Isaiah was saying that God creates calamity rather than evil. God's calamities are moral, they might insist. This is cold comfort, is it not? Jeffers has a good point, and he's not the first to make it. He is presenting us with the problem of evil that must vex every monotheistic theologian, at least every honest monotheistic theologian. Well, Jeffers is trying to be honest, and he is quite vexed indeed. He then sings, "This coast crying out for tragedy like all beautiful places. The quiet ones ask for quieter suffering." Here we see a poetic extrapolation of the problem. If good and evil are a package deal, then be wary of beauty, or at least be warned. A beautiful place is thus a sort of femme fatale, not unlike Jeffers' protagonist Tamar, whom Jeffers suggests may have been crafted by the wild rock coast of her breeding. She is at once symbolic of the greater inhuman beauty and the idea that one is crafted by one's environment, that individuality, like individual freedom, is an illusion. The suggestion that beautiful places cry out for tragedy might be an irrational response to the problem of evil, but it is an understandable human response, and that's more than satisfactory because this is not logic, this is poetry, and we are humans. As this is poetry, we soon see the declaration again. This coast crying out for tragedy like all beautiful places. It is not merely a verse. It is a refrain. How does our poet respond to this realization? Jeffers goes native. He thinks like a shaman. He cannot be scientific. There's no science for this. All he can do is burn sacrifices. But he dare not murder a lamb. Instead, he imagines his victims. He imagines Tamar. Again, this is poetry. I do not advise that we take all this literally. But we can come dangerously close to taking the poet at his word. Frankly, I think this is a fantasy, but it rings true. I don't believe that Jeffers actually calculated that crafting horror stories would magic horror away from the house. Rather, I think he deemed this fantasy felt true enough that he could act upon it and proceed to burn sacrifices once a year, which is more or less what he went on to do. And note the periodicity of the phrase once a year. I don't think it's accidental. Back to Tamar, Jeffers' iconic burnt offering. Her beauty and wild freedom conceived within her the desire and hubris that led her to tragedy. She is a fire, that is, a species of fire, a flame of desire that grows into a fire of hateful destruction. This is corroborated by Tamar's appearances in other Jeffers poems. For instance, we find her identified as fire in the poem Point Pinos and Point Lobos. Jeffers writes, "Old buttressed cypress trunks in the burnt place where that wild girl whose soul was fire died with her house." In Apology for Bad Dreams, we meet Tamar as a fire spirit, a personification of desire. Jeffers writes, "White as the half-moon at midnight, someone flame-like passed me, saying, 'I am Tamar Caldwell. I have my desire.'" After Tamar passes by, we hear the voice of the sea return to call for fire. Then the voice of the sea returned when she had gone by. Beautiful country, burn again. Point Pinos down to the Sur rivers. Burn as before with bitter wonders, land and ocean, and the Carmel water. Perhaps the voice of the poet is intended here, rather than that of the sea. It is hard to be sure, but the message remains the same: burn again. This burning, as it involves the burning of both land and sea, seems to represent cyclic conflagration, ekpyrosis. That is, repeated cycles of conflagration and rebirth. It happens that the beautiful country to which Jeffers refers is quite literally inclined to burn periodically, so the cosmic reflects the regional. Perhaps Tamar can sense that, and perhaps her desire reflects the universal will. This should not be conflated with enlightenment, however. In Jeffers' terms, Tamar is anything but enlightened. Yes, she is doing God's will, perhaps, but that is no sign of enlightenment or inner peace. It would be a mistake to call her evil. Neither is she an inhumanist heroine. She simply is what she is. Finally, Jeffers confesses that his shamanistic response to evil is ridiculous. He is only aping God. He then reflects on the absurdity of God himself, and finally confesses that he does not understand the world. He sees no reason, no rationality in things. He writes, "I have seen these ways of God. I know of no reason for fire and change and torture and the old returnings." As Tamar initially found the ways of recurrence to be frustrating and humiliating, so the author of Apology finds himself utterly perplexed and powerless before the returnings of God. All he can think to do in his state of ignorance and powerlessness is, like a shaman of forgotten times, craft a victim and burn a sacrifice. It is absurd and ridiculous, and true. It is hard to see Tamar's end as a happy one. But Apology for Bad Dreams, while confronting the existential torture, the tragedy, and the absurdity, concludes on an exultant note. Where Tamar burns away in homicidal fury, Apology exults in the ever-returning magnificence embodied in the world. God, one might say, made flesh. Jeffers continues on the ways of God and concludes, "He being sufficient might be still. I think they admit no reason. They are the ways of my love. Unmeasured power, incredible passion, enormous craft. No thought apparent but burns darkly, smothered with its own smoke in the human brain vault. No thought outside. A certain measure in phenomena. The fountains of the boiling stars, the flowers on the foreland, the ever-returning roses of dawn. In the end, it is all beauty.